Some doors are opened by fate, but the ones that matter most are opened by kindness. Every morning before sunrise, Eleanor Brooks followed the same quiet routine. She stirred the fire inside her little cabin, filled an old iron kettle with fresh well water, and stepped onto the weathered front porch to greet another lonely dawn along the northern edge of Blackwood Valley. The forest always seemed to wake before the people did. Tall pines whispered in the cool breeze, birds called softly from hidden branches, and silver mist drifted between the trees like wandering spirits that had forgotten where they belonged. Eleanor had lived alone for almost 3 years, ever since her own pack quietly decided she no longer mattered. She was an omega without status, without family, and without anyone willing to speak her name unless they needed someone to blame. The villagers said she brought bad luck wherever she walked. Children were warned not to wander near her cabin, and merchants often looked away when she passed through the market with her small basket of herbs and vegetables. She never argued. She never begged. She simply smiled with quiet grace and returned home before sunset, believing that bitterness only made an empty house feel colder. That morning, however, something was different. As Eleanor reached for the broom leaning beside the door, she noticed a tiny bundle curled against the wooden steps. At first she thought someone had abandoned an old blanket during the night, but then the bundle trembled. 2 bright blue eyes slowly opened beneath soft silver fur. A wolf pup no bigger than a house cat stared up at her with exhausted curiosity. Its little paws were muddy, its ribs showed beneath its thin coat, and dried leaves clung to its tail. Eleanor knelt without hesitation, her expression softening into quiet concern. "Well, where did you come from, little one?" she whispered. The pup let out the faintest whine before resting its tiny head against her boot as though it had spent every last ounce of strength searching for this exact doorstep. Eleanor carefully lifted it into her arms. It was lighter than she expected, barely heavier than a folded quilt. She carried the little creature inside, wrapped it in a warm towel, and set a small bowl of goat's milk beside the fireplace. The pup drank slowly, stopping every few seconds to glance at her as if trying to memorize her face. Eleanor could not explain why, but she felt an unfamiliar warmth settle quietly inside her chest. Outside, hidden beyond the tree line nearly 100 yards away, silent shapes watched from the shadows. Massive wolves with coats as dark as midnight stood perfectly still among the pines. None of them growled. None of them moved. They simply watched the lonely omega welcome another orphan into her home without asking for anything in return. At the center of the hidden pack stood the largest wolf any hunter had ever imagined. His silver eyes never left the cabin window glowing softly through the morning mist. The great wolf remained motionless for another long moment before silently turning back into the endless forest. Eleanor never noticed the watchers. She spent the rest of the day mending the frightened pup's tiny blanket, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing when winters felt especially long. By evening, the little wolf had fallen asleep beside the fireplace with its nose resting against her hand. Eleanor smiled to herself, believing fate had simply placed one lost child in need of a home. She had no way of knowing that before another sunrise arrived, someone or something would leave another orphan waiting quietly on her porch. The next morning Eleanor awoke before the first rays of sunlight touched the valley, certain that the strange little visitor from the day before had simply been a lonely accident. She quietly opened the front door with a mug of warm tea in her hand, only to stop in complete surprise. Another tiny wolf pup was sleeping on the porch, curled into a perfect circle beside a small bundle of wildflowers that had clearly not been there the night before. This one had soft grey fur with bright golden eyes that blinked slowly as though it already trusted her. Eleanor looked beyond the porch toward the silent forest, expecting to find worried parents waiting nearby, but the towering pines stood perfectly still. Beneath the pale morning sky, not a single sound answered her gentle call. She knelt once more and smiled with quiet tenderness. "You must be hungry too," she whispered before carefully lifting the second pup into her arms. Inside the cabin, the first little wolf greeted the newcomer with cheerful little barks, their tails wagging as though they had known each other forever. Eleanor laughed softly, a sound that had become rare within those lonely walls, and prepared another bowl of warm milk while searching through her small pantry for enough food to feed them both. By the end of the week there were 4 pups sleeping near the fireplace. Each arrived before dawn. Each appeared alone. None showed signs of fear the moment they saw Eleanor. She repaired an old wooden basket into a cozy bed, stitched tiny blankets from worn pieces of cloth, and spent long evenings humming gentle songs while brushing leaves from their soft coats. Although money had always been scarce, she somehow found ways to stretch every loaf of bread, every jar of goat milk, and every handful of vegetables from her small garden. She never once considered turning any of them away. The village, however, noticed the growing family. Whispers followed Eleanor wherever she walked through the marketplace. Some claimed the wolves were dangerous. Others insisted the forest spirits had cursed her lonely cabin. A few even crossed the street rather than pass beside her basket filled with tiny blankets and fresh herbs. Normal people do not collect wolves, one merchant muttered loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Another woman shook her head and sighed. She has always been different. Now even wild animals choose her instead of their own kind. Eleanor heard every word, yet she answered none of them. She simply finished buying flour, thanked the baker with a gentle smile, and returned home before the afternoon clouds gathered over the valley. That evening she sat on the front steps watching the pups chase drifting leaves across the yard. Their playful little paws scattered golden maple leaves through the cool autumn air while tiny happy howls echoed between the trees. For the first time in years the silence surrounding her cabin no longer felt empty. As darkness slowly settled across Blackwood Valley, dozens of glowing eyes quietly appeared beyond the tree line. Hidden among the shadows, enormous wolves stood in complete silence, watching the tiny family with calm patience. They never crossed into the clearing. They never frightened the pups. They simply observed until the moon climbed high above the forest. Then, as quietly as they had come, every great wolf disappeared into the darkness once again. Eleanor never looked toward the trees that night. She was too busy wrapping another tiny blanket around the newest arrival, unaware that before the next sunrise, one more small life would be waiting faithfully at her door. By the time the first frost settled across Blackwood Valley, Eleanor had stopped asking herself why another little wolf always seemed to appear before dawn. Instead, she began leaving a small woven basket beside her front door every night, lined with fresh blankets and warmed by smooth stones she heated beside the fireplace. Somehow, every morning, the basket was no longer empty. Some pups arrived timid and exhausted, while others bounced clumsily across the porch with innocent curiosity, but every one of them paused the moment they saw Eleanor, as though they had finally reached the place they had been searching for. Her tiny cabin slowly transformed into something it had never been before. Little paw prints decorated the wooden floor. Hand-sewn blankets covered every corner near the fireplace. Small carved bowls lined the kitchen shelf beside jars of herbs and honey. Eleanor spent her mornings gathering berries that were safe for growing pups, her afternoons repairing worn fences and tending her vegetable garden, and her evenings brushing soft coats while humming the same gentle lullaby her mother had once sung beneath quiet winter skies. She gave each pup a name inspired by the forest around them. Ash had silver ears that always twitched at every bird song. Maple loved sleeping beneath the kitchen table. River insisted on following Eleanor from room to room, never allowing more than a few feet between them. Briar was fearless, climbing onto chairs much too tall for his tiny legs before tumbling safely into piles of folded blankets. Watching them grow filled the cabin with laughter Eleanor had almost forgotten she was capable of. Even the long lonely nights no longer felt empty. Yet beyond the warmth inside the cabin, the whispers throughout the village grew colder with every passing week. Travelers claimed they had seen wolves wandering peacefully near Eleanor's property without ever crossing the fence. Hunters complained that no wild animal ventured close to the valley anymore, as though the entire forest had quietly changed its path. One afternoon, while Eleanor carried a basket of vegetables home from the market, two older women lowered their voices just enough for her to hear. "There must be a reason the wolves trust only her," one murmured. "Perhaps the forest has marked her." The other frowned uneasily. "Or perhaps something in those woods wants us to stay away." Eleanor continued walking without turning around. She had grown accustomed to being misunderstood long before the pups had entered her life. What mattered to her was the joyful chorus waiting inside her little cabin each evening. One cool autumn night, after every pup had finally fallen asleep, Eleanor stepped onto the porch with a wool shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The moon hung bright above the towering pines, painting the valley in soft silver light. She smiled quietly as a crisp breeze carried the comforting scent of cedar through the air. Then she noticed something she had never seen before. Along the edge of the forest, dozens of tiny lights shimmered between the trees. At first she believed they were fireflies lingering long after summer, but the lights moved together with quiet purpose. They were eyes. Calm. Watchful. Patient. None of the great wolves stepped into the clearing. They simply stood beneath the moon, surrounding the cabin from a respectful distance as silent guardians. Eleanor felt no fear. Instead, an unexplainable peace settled over her heart, as though the forest itself had whispered that she was not alone anymore. Hidden farther back among the ancient pines stood one enormous black wolf whose silver eyes reflected the moonlight more brightly than the stars above. He watched Eleanor gently pull the shawl tighter against the cold before she smiled toward the silent woods and returned inside. The great wolf remained motionless long after the cabin lights dimmed, and for the first time in many years, something that resembled hope stirred quietly within the heart of a king who had not yet spoken a single word to the woman who had unknowingly become the safest home in his kingdom. Several days later, the rhythm of Eleanor's life had become as steady as the changing seasons. Every sunrise began with eager little paws tapping across the wooden floor, every afternoon echoed with playful howls drifting through the fenced garden, and every evening ended beside the warm fireplace where the growing family slept in peaceful comfort. The wolf pups had become healthier, stronger, and wonderfully curious. They chased falling leaves, explored every corner of the yard, and somehow always returned the moment Eleanor softly called their names. She often laughed to herself, wondering how creatures born in the wild could be so gentle. One cloudy afternoon, while gathering herbs along the edge of the forest, Eleanor noticed fresh paw prints pressed into the damp earth. They were enormous, far larger than any wolf she had ever imagined. The tracks circled the clearing where the pups had been playing before disappearing silently between the ancient pines. She studied them for a long moment, then quietly smiled instead of worrying. Whoever had left those prints had approached close enough to watch, yet nothing had been disturbed. Not a single flower had been crushed. Not a single fence post had been broken. It felt less like a warning and more like a quiet visit from an unseen guardian. That evening the forest grew unusually still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath beneath the rising moon. Eleanor tucked every sleepy pup beneath their blankets before stepping outside with a small lantern to collect firewood stacked beside the porch. As she reached for another bundle of split cedar, she sensed eyes upon her once again. Looking toward the tree line, she found them waiting. Exactly where they always seemed to appear. Massive wolves stood silently beneath the silver light, their thick coats glowing softly beneath the moon. There were dozens of them now. None crossed the clearing. None made a threatening sound. They simply watched with remarkable patience. Eleanor placed the lantern on the porch railing and gave a tiny wave almost without thinking. To her surprise, several wolves lowered their heads as though acknowledging her greeting before remaining perfectly still. A quiet smile touched her lips. "Thank you for watching over them," she whispered, uncertain why those words suddenly felt right. Hidden among the silent guardians stood the largest wolf of them all. His midnight black coat seemed to absorb the moonlight instead of reflecting it, while his silver eyes never left the woman standing alone before the cabin. This was Alpha King Adrian Blackwood, ruler of every northern pack, though no crown rested upon his head in this form. Beside him stood an older grey wolf with thoughtful amber eyes. The elder glanced toward Eleanor before lowering his voice. "She still does not know." Adrian remained silent. "She has accepted every pup," the elder continued. "Not one has been turned away. Not even during the coldest nights." The great black wolf slowly lifted his gaze toward the warm glow shining through the cabin windows where tiny shadows played across the curtains. His expression softened with something few had witnessed from their king in many years. Respect. Every orphan left upon that porch had reached safety because Eleanor never paused to ask where they came from or what they might cost her. She simply opened the door. Adrian finally turned away from the clearing, but before disappearing into the darkness he looked back one last time. Inside the cabin, the smallest pup had climbed into Eleanor's lap and fallen peacefully asleep against her heart. The sight lingered in the Alpha King's mind as he vanished between the towering pines, unaware that before another week had passed, fate would place a single frightened newcomer on Eleanor's porch whose arrival would change not only her quiet life, but the destiny of the entire kingdom. The first snow of the season arrived quietly, covering Blackwood Valley beneath a blanket of sparkling white that made the forest seem softer than ever before. Eleanor woke before dawn as usual, pulled on her thick wool coat, and opened the front door with a peaceful smile she had come to cherish each morning. The woven basket was not empty. Curled tightly inside was the smallest wolf pup she had ever seen. Unlike the others, this little one did not lift its head or wag its tail. Its breathing was slow and gentle, and its snowy white fur blended almost perfectly with the frost that covered the porch. Eleanor immediately knelt beside the basket, wrapping the tiny creature inside her scarf before carrying it into the warmth of the cabin. The other pups gathered around in complete silence, their playful energy replaced by quiet concern as they gently sniffed the newcomer. It was the first time Eleanor had ever seen them behave that way. She warmed fresh goat milk over the fire, mixed in a little honey and crushed herbs, and patiently fed the tiny pup one careful sip at a time. Hours passed before the little wolf finally opened its pale silver eyes. They were unlike any she had seen before. They shimmered with remarkable intelligence, almost as though an old soul hid behind such a young face. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Welcome home, little one," she whispered. "You will not be alone anymore." Outside the cabin, hidden high among the snow-covered pines, Adrian Blackwood stood once again in his great black wolf form. Beside him waited the same elder grey wolf, watching the smoke curl gently from Eleanor's chimney. "That was the last one," the elder said quietly. Adrian kept his gaze fixed upon the cabin. "Every orphan from the Northern Territories has found shelter." The elder slowly nodded. The mothers trusted only one place before they disappeared. Even those who had never seen the woman somehow followed her scent. Adrian remained silent, but deep inside his heart another truth had begun to take shape. It was not fate alone drawing the pups toward Eleanor. Kindness had its own scent, one stronger than fear, stronger than instinct, and somehow strong enough for even the youngest wolves to recognize. Later that afternoon, Eleanor noticed something unusual. None of the pups wandered far from the newest arrival. Ash curled beside it. River brought a favorite pine cone and carefully placed it nearby. Maple gently rested against its side to keep it warm. It was as though every member of the growing family understood that this tiny newcomer needed them all. Eleanor watched the scene with quiet amazement before adding another small blanket to the basket. "Looks like you already have brothers and sisters," she said with a soft laugh. As evening settled across the valley, snowflakes drifted lazily beyond the windows while the fire crackled peacefully inside the cabin. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair with the smallest pup sleeping safely against her chest, surrounded by the gentle breathing of every wolf she had welcomed into her home. She had no title, no wealth, and no one beyond these walls who truly believed in her. Yet in that simple cabin she had unknowingly created something no palace in the kingdom could offer. A place where every frightened child was accepted before a single question was asked. Far beyond the clearing, Adrian slowly lowered his head in silent respect before disappearing once again into the snowy forest. He had planned only to observe the mysterious woman a little longer, but destiny had begun arranging a different path. Very soon, he would no longer be able to remain a silent guardian hidden among the trees. 3 mornings later the valley awoke beneath a sky the color of polished silver, and an unfamiliar silence settled over the forest. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs as Eleanor stepped outside carrying a basket of firewood. The snow beneath her boots remained untouched except for one unmistakable trail of enormous paw prints leading from the trees to her porch and back again. They were the same massive tracks she had discovered weeks before, but this time they stopped only a few feet from her front door. Eleanor looked toward the quiet pines, her heart filled not with fear but with curiosity. She softly whispered, "Whoever you are, thank you for trusting me." A gentle breeze answered by stirring the branches overhead before fading into stillness once more. Inside the cabin the pups had become a lively family, filling every corner with playful energy. The smallest white pup, whom Eleanor had named Snow, had finally found the strength to explore alongside the others. Although Snow remained quieter than the rest, Every older pup watched over the little one with remarkable devotion. Eleanor often smiled as she watched them share blankets, nudge food toward one another, and curl together beside the fire each evening. They behaved less like abandoned strays and more like brothers and sisters bound by something deeper than chance. Later that afternoon, Eleanor walked into the village carrying fresh bread she had baked from the last of her winter flour. She hoped to trade a few loaves for extra goat milk, knowing the growing pups would soon need more than she could provide alone. As she entered the small market square, conversations slowed. Several villagers glanced toward the basket she carried, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of tiny paws. An elderly shopkeeper studied her kindly before speaking in a gentle voice. "Miss Brooks, people have been saying strange things." Eleanor smiled politely. "People usually do." The old man hesitated before continuing. "Travelers claim they have seen great wolves escorting lost children through the northern woods. Every trail ends somewhere near your cabin." Eleanor lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Then perhaps those children found where they belonged. The shopkeeper could only nod, unable to explain why her simple answer lingered in his thoughts long after she walked away. As evening approached, Eleanor returned home beneath softly falling snow. The pups greeted her with cheerful excitement, weaving happily around her boots as she unpacked fresh supplies. She laughed, brushing melting snowflakes from their soft fur, completely unaware that she was being watched more closely than ever before. Hidden among the towering pines stood Adrian Blackwood once again, though this night he was no longer alone. Several trusted wolves waited quietly behind their king. None dared speak until Adrian finally broke the silence. "She has asked for nothing," he said, his calm voice carrying through the frozen forest. "She has never searched for reward, never questioned our intentions, and never abandoned a single child placed before her." The elder grey wolf lowered his head respectfully. "Will you tell her the truth?" Adrian's silver eyes remained fixed upon the warm light glowing from Eleanor's cabin windows. "Not yet," he answered quietly. "She deserves to choose her path before she learns who has been walking beside it." Deep inside the cabin, Snow suddenly lifted the tiny white head and looked directly toward the dark forest, as though recognizing a familiar presence beyond the walls. Adrian noticed the movement, and a faint smile, almost forgotten by time itself, touched his face for only a heartbeat before disappearing again. Fate had carried him to the edge of Eleanor's quiet life countless times, but the distance between watcher and stranger was growing smaller with every passing day, and neither of them could stop the moment that was steadily drawing near. Winter settled fully over Blackwood Valley, wrapping every pine branch in shimmering white and turning the little cabin into a warm island of light surrounded by endless snow. Eleanor had almost forgotten what true loneliness felt like. Every morning began with eager little paws waiting outside her bedroom door, every afternoon echoed with cheerful games in the fenced yard, and every evening ended with sleepy pups piled together beside the fireplace. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It had become a family. Yet something quietly changed as the days passed. The older pups often paused during their play and lifted their noses toward the forest at exactly the same moment, as though hearing a distant call that Eleanor could not. They never ran away. Instead, they would simply stare toward the trees for several silent seconds before returning to their games, completely at peace. Eleanor noticed the strange habit but never questioned it. Somehow it felt natural, almost comforting, as if invisible friends were checking to make sure everyone was safe. One snowy afternoon she carried fresh blankets outside to hang beneath the pale winter sun. While shaking the last blanket free of snowflakes, she noticed movement beyond the fence. A magnificent black wolf stood among the towering pines. He was larger than any wolf she had ever imagined, his thick coat darker than the surrounding shadows, his silver eyes calm rather than threatening. The world seemed to fall completely silent. Eleanor slowly lowered the blanket, her heart beating a little faster, yet no fear entered her thoughts. The great wolf simply watched her. Then he glanced toward the pups, happily chasing one another through the snow before returning his steady gaze to Eleanor. Neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. For a brief moment it felt as though they understood each other without speaking a single word. Eleanor offered the same gentle smile she had given every frightened little pup who had ever arrived at her door. "They are doing well," she said softly, her voice almost carried away by the breeze. You do not have to worry about them. The black wolf remained perfectly still. Then, with slow deliberate grace, he lowered his head in what looked unmistakably like gratitude before disappearing soundlessly into the forest. Eleanor stood frozen long after he was gone, unable to explain why the simple gesture filled her heart with unexpected emotion. Hidden deeper among the trees, the elder grey wolf stepped beside Adrian Blackwood after the king resumed his human form beneath the shelter of the pines. Snow rested lightly upon Adrian's dark coat as he continued watching the cabin from a respectful distance. She greeted you as though you were an old friend, the elder observed quietly. Adrian's expression remained thoughtful. She has never judged by appearances, he replied. Not once. The elder smiled faintly. Most would have fled. Adrian shook his head. She only saw someone watching over children. As twilight settled across the valley, Eleanor gathered every pup inside before another gentle snowfall began. Snow climbed into her lap while Ash rested beside the rocking chair, and the others drifted peacefully to sleep beneath layers of warm blankets. Eleanor looked through the frost-covered window toward the dark forest one last time before closing the curtains. She did not know the silent guardian she had finally seen was the ruler of every northern pack. She did not know he had waited countless nights beneath those very trees. But somewhere deep within her heart, she sensed that the distance between her quiet little cabin and the mysterious soul beyond the forest had become much smaller than either of them had ever expected. The following morning the valley shimmered beneath fresh snow, and for the first time in many weeks no new pup waited on Eleanor's porch. She stood quietly with a small smile, almost surprised by the empty basket she had grown accustomed to filling with warm blankets every evening. Instead of disappointment, she felt gratitude. Every little soul who had arrived had found comfort, laughter, and a family beneath her roof. Perhaps, she thought, whoever had been sending them finally knew they were safe. Inside the cabin the pups had begun to grow into confident young wolves. They no longer stumbled over their own paws, and they eagerly helped one another in ways that constantly amazed Eleanor. Ash gently nudged Snow toward the warmest spot beside the fireplace. River always waited until the smallest pups finished eating before touching his own bowl. Maple patiently carried sticks back to the woodpile whenever Eleanor gathered firewood, proudly dropping each one near the porch as though contributing to the household. Watching them together filled Eleanor with a quiet joy she had never expected to know. That afternoon, while brushing Snow's soft white coat, Eleanor noticed a delicate silver marking hidden beneath the thick fur around the little wolf's shoulder. Curious, she looked more closely and discovered nearly every pup carried a different natural marking. Some resembled tiny crescent moons. Others looked like stars, pine branches, or flowing rivers. None appeared random. They seemed almost like gentle signatures left by nature itself. Eleanor traced Snow's silver marking with one careful finger before smiling. "Every one of you is wonderfully unique," she whispered. "Maybe someone wanted to make sure you would always remember where you came from." Hidden high upon a snowy ridge overlooking the valley, Adrian Blackwood listened quietly as the elder grey wolf approached once more. "The markings have begun to appear," the elder said softly. Adrian nodded. "They only reveal themselves once the pups feel completely safe." The elder smiled knowingly. "She has given them that without ever realizing it." Adrian looked toward the cabin where cheerful laughter drifted through the crisp winter air. "Those markings identify the bloodlines of the oldest northern packs," he explained. "Many families believed those lines had vanished forever." The elder lowered his head thoughtfully. "Instead, their future has been sleeping beside her fireplace." Adrian's silver eyes reflected the distant cabin light. "Not because I commanded it," he said quietly. "Their mothers chose her before their final journeys. They trusted a stranger more than kingdoms or titles. The truth settled between them like softly falling snow. Even the Alpha King had not ordered the orphaned pups to Eleanor's home. One by one, grieving mothers from distant territories had followed instinct, hope, and whispers carried through the forest until they reached the lonely cabin where kindness lived without conditions. The wolves had merely honored those final wishes by watching over the children from afar. As evening settled across Blackwood Valley, Eleanor opened the cabin door to let the pups enjoy the gently falling snow before bedtime. They raced happily through the clearing, leaving tiny trails that sparkled beneath the moonlight. Looking toward the forest, Eleanor quietly placed another empty basket beside her front steps, lining it with a freshly sewn blanket just as she always had. She smiled softly at the silent trees. If another little one ever needs a home, she whispered into the peaceful night, the door will always be open. Hidden among the pines, Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment. In all his years as king, he had witnessed courage, loyalty, and sacrifice, but nothing had humbled him more than a woman who continued preparing a place for someone who might never come, simply because love, in her heart, was never meant to have a limit. Spring arrived quietly in Blackwood Valley, melting the last patches of snow until fresh streams flowed once again beneath the towering pines. The little cabin that had once stood alone now echoed with joyful life as the young wolves raced across fields bright with wildflowers, their playful voices blending with birdsong carried on the morning breeze. Eleanor stood on the porch watching them with peaceful eyes, amazed by how much they had grown. The frightened little orphans who had once fit inside a single basket now ran with confidence, kindness, and gentle hearts. They never wandered far before looking back toward the woman who had become their home. That morning, however, something extraordinary happened. Instead of one pair of glowing eyes appearing beyond the forest, dozens emerged together. Great wolves stepped silently from between the ancient pines, forming a wide circle around the clearing. They remained calm, their heads lowered in quiet respect rather than fear or dominance. The young wolves immediately stopped playing, not because they were frightened, but because they recognized familiar scents carried on the spring air. Eleanor's heart beat a little faster as the enormous black wolf she had seen only once before walked slowly into the sunlight. His silver eyes met hers with the same calm warmth she remembered. For several long moments the valley remained completely silent. Then, before her astonished eyes, a soft golden light surrounded the magnificent wolf. When it faded, a tall man stood where the great guardian had been only seconds earlier. He wore a dark coat that moved gently in the breeze, and his silver eyes were unchanged, carrying the same quiet strength she had seen beneath the moonlight. Eleanor understood at once that she was standing before someone far greater than an ordinary traveler. Yet she noticed something else before anything about his appearance. He smiled at the young wolves exactly the way she always had. Adrian Blackwood stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. He placed one hand over his heart and inclined his head with sincere respect. "My name is Adrian," he said gently. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." Eleanor looked at him in stunned silence before glancing toward the wolves surrounding the clearing. Everything suddenly made sense. The silent guardians. The enormous paw prints. The watchful eyes beyond the trees. Adrian continued softly, "I came today because there is something you deserve to know. I never ordered those children to your door. Their mothers chose you. Somehow, across mountains and forests, they believed that if their little ones reached this cabin, they would know love instead of loneliness." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she looked toward the young wolves playing peacefully nearby. Adrian smiled gently. "You protected the future of families you had never met. You asked for no reward. You expected no recognition. You simply opened your door every single time." One by one, every great wolf around the clearing lowered its head toward Eleanor. The young wolves followed, gathering happily around her with wagging tails. Adrian took one final step forward before speaking words that would be remembered throughout the kingdom for generations. "A crown does not create a queen," he said. "Compassion does. Before any title, before any throne, these children chose you with their trust. Their mothers chose you with their hope. And today, my kingdom chooses you with its gratitude." Eleanor wiped away a quiet tear before smiling at every familiar face surrounding her. She had once believed she was the forgotten Omega no one wanted. Yet without ever seeking greatness, she had become the heart of an entire kingdom. As warm sunlight filled the valley, the young wolves raced joyfully around the cabin they would always call home, and for the first time in many years, Blackwood Valley was no longer remembered as the place where an Omega lived alone. It became the place where kindness changed the destiny of a kingdom, proving that the strongest heart is often the gentlest one of all.